This first lecture in the series or in the module on African background will concern land and people, prehistory, early civilizations, ethnicity and culture, religions of Africa. I'll try to keep this as short as I possibly can, but kind of bear with me on this first one. The objectives of this lecture are to help you to understand the geographic and ethnic diversity of the African continent, to help you be able to, or I would like for you to be able to discuss the origins of human life in Africa, to be able to discuss early civilization in the Nile River Valley, and to describe some general characteristics of African cultures. So let's get started. We'll take a look at some little information on the land and the people. Africa is the second largest continent in the world. From the map, you can see the nations other continents that border it, the oceans that border it, the main river systems, which you can't see on this map, on the African continent include the Nile, the Niger, the Congo, the Senegal, and the Zambezi. There are 3 deserts also located on the continent, the Sahara in the north, and the Namib and the Kalahari in the south. Today, there are 53 independent nations on the African continent, and the population is estimated at over 976 million people. That's about 14.5% of the world's population. The population is growing at about 2.3% annually. Here's some other interesting facts statistics that you might want to take a look at in terms of the continent. The life expectancy generally, as an average, the continent-wide is about 47 years. The infant mortality rate is about 96 per 1,000 births. The number of people living with AIDS or HIV across the continent is about 24.8 million. And that is, I think, as of about 2005 or 2006. Female literacy is about 64%. The gross national income per capita is about $842. You might want to just look around and compare that with gross national income in the United States. 39% of the working population are young people, but 59.5% of these young people are unemployed. Major religions across the continent are the traditional religions, Islam, and Christianity. I don't want to duplicate what's in your textbook, so I'm just going to mention that the section on prehistory is on pages 3 and 4 of chapter 1 in the textbook. Just by way of summary, what the authors are generally trying to get you to see is that the oldest human remains in the world, remains of what have been called Homo habilis, were discovered in East Africa. These date to about 2.4 million years ago, and they were discovered in Olduvai Gorge in East Africa, in that Great Rift Valley, if you look at the map at the top of the page. Other remains, the remains of Homo erectus or Lucy, were discovered in Ethiopia, and these date from about 1.8 million years. These seem to suggest that, support theories, that human life emerged in Africa, that modern humans emerged in Africa, and then that this human life spread to other continents and other parts of Africa, what has been described as the out of Africa theory. The earliest civilizations on the African continent emerged in Egypt about the 4th millennium BCE, and Nubia, which is south of Egypt. In the 2nd millennium, Nubia was an Egyptian colony, but by the end of this millennium, Nubians established the independent kingdom of Kush. Kushites eventually took over Upper and Lower Egypt and established Kushite pharaohs as the rulers of the 25th dynasty. Egyptian rulers conquered the Kushite capital at Kerma in 540 BCE, and then the Kushites moved their capital further south to a place called Meroe. Meroe is at the very bottom the last little city that you see on this map at the very bottom of the map. In the 4th century CE, Aksum, or modern Ethiopia, conquered Kush. Aksum was the first Christian nation in sub-Saharan Africa. Another important development, if we look at Africa, as we look at Africa, we need to take a look at ethnic and tribal groups. At the time of the transatlantic slave trade, which was 1500s to the late 1800s, there were over 800 ethnic or tribal groups. These could be divided into 6 identifiable cultural groups that you'll see on the map, on this map, from the Afro-Asiatic group, which involved 172 ethnic groups, or included 172 ethnic groups, all the way down to the very bottom in southern Africa to the Khoisan, including 9 ethnic groups. So you can see that these groupings vary in size, and what they generally share in common is some cultural patterns and even some language groupings. If we look a little more deeply into this in terms of ethnic groups in West and East Africa, in West Africa, and you'll see that these are kind of, what you're looking at is the application or an overlay of ethnic groups on modern national groupings. And these national groupings did not exist before the 20th century, before the independence movements in the 20th century. But if you look at the ethnic groups, let's say, look at Mali, and you'll see that the ethnic groups in Mali include the Dogon, the Bambara, the Senufo, and the Mandinka. If you look at, let's say, Nigeria, you've got the Nok, you've got the Igbo. Then down in the corner, you have the Yoruba, and you have the Fon. But you'd find Yoruba and Fon also in the nation of Benin. Then if you look at, let's say, East Africa, you see some of the same, you see some patterns in terms of prominent ethnic groups. Look at Kenya, for example. President Obama's relatives and ancestors come from Kenya. And you see that 2 of the very prominent groups there are the Kikuyu and the Mijikenda, and also the Maasai, but you'd find Maasai in Kenya as well as in Tanzania. Generally speaking, in terms of African culture, let's just take a quick look at some cultural patterns. And again, there's much more information about this, much more detail in Chapter 1. Life was far from static in Africa. So whatever we see in the textbook in terms of maybe culture in Africa today is not necessarily the way that culture or African cultures were 500-600 years ago. This is not a static situation where people are locked into a particular way of life and particular patterns of life, and nothing ever changes. African culture was characterized by diversity in language, in cultural groups and ethnic groups. People of Africa did not belong to one single race, and in fact, race is a fairly modern concept, and we'll talk about this as we get a little more into the establishment of African slavery, black slavery in the New World. We'll see where this concept of race comes from. It's often more useful to look at language groupings rather than to try to identify racial groups. And on the African continent, we've got, again, if we think of those cultural groups and those ethnic groups, we could also see that there's some, that here we have the language groups. And you see one commonality here. There is the Khoisan language group, and there was the Khoisan as far as a grouping of tribal and ethnic groups in southern Africa. Now, culture. People organized themselves into many different political units of varying size and degrees of complexity. Family was the basis of social organization. Probably we could say that family is also the most basic of these ways in which people organize themselves. So we go from family to tribe to village to nation to kingdom, whatever. So you can see the different levels of complexity that people organized in on the African continent. Most people lived in villages. Kinship ties were particularly strong. Family is important. Kinship is, as we can imagine, kinship relates to family groupings and family ties. Kinship systems could vary. Some were patrilineal, others were matrilineal. This has to do with the way in which descent or lineage is traced within a society. And that has to do with who you owe your primary allegiance to. If you have a matrilineal system, then your primary allegiance in terms of where you might inherit property or from whom you might inherit property, who makes decisions about where people will live. That particular term for determining where you're going to live is focality, but it could be a matrifocal society growing out of matrilineal descent or patrilineal descent, just the opposite. Or it could be a mixed system where you have some things determined patrilineally, some things determined matrilineally. There was an emphasis on interdependence rather than individuality. And values were often expressed in proverbs or symbols or art. And you see some examples of this at the very top of the page, right next to culture. You see that symbol, which is the symbol for Sankofa. There's another symbol that also is for Sankofa, but this is one I thought would be very interesting. The other one looks a little bit like a heart with the two sides of it curled up. I'll have to show you that. I'll put that on another slide a little bit later. But Sankofa is the value that you're representing is return and get it, or the idea that it is important, that learning is important, particularly learning about the past or learning from the past. So you look back to the past to help you understand the present and to predict or to help with making plans for the future. That's a value that is expressed symbolically. Or down at the very bottom, you have the symbol Nyame Biribi Wo Soro, which is God is in the heavens, and that's a symbol for hope. In some societies practice polygamy, where you have multiple spouses. Men have multiple spouses. Not every society, again, this is just generally. Within societies, gender roles reflected the complementary nature of society. Within a society, men had certain things that they did, women had certain things that they did, and these were complementing each other. For example, if we look at the area of economics and trade, both men and women were involved in trade, but women were more likely to be involved in the local trade, the market trade, men in the long-distance trade. Men and women were involved in agriculture. Women may produce crops that are specifically for consumption within the group, for the family. Corn, for example. Men may produce crops that are for transport and for sale beyond the village and beyond the community, like yams. Within these societies, and we'll talk a little more about religion in a few minutes, but these were societies where you might find more polytheism, more than one god being worshipped, but generally a feeling that one of these gods was superior, and then there was a pantheon of other deities, and some of these deities were women. I've talked a little about the farming and the market, so I won't go back into that. Societies used the oral tradition as a way of passing on information from one generation to the other. Griots and praise singers were the historians in many African communities. And some of these griots and praise singers could be women, or might be women. In terms of religion, there are different patterns of religion. The symbol on this page is the symbol called Janami, which expresses the idea of except for God, and is a symbol for the supremacy of God. But when we talk about the supremacy of God and respect for it, we have to realize that on the African continent, there are several patterns or types of ways of organizing religion. There's the traditional or indigenous belief system, which was polytheistic with an all-powerful God, active ancestor spirits that could have some impact on the way in which on people's lives today, very ritualistic. Spirit possession was a part of this. You had to, the spirits were seen as being, the spirit world was all around us. It could be in objects, it could be in nature. There's the expression of the saying, listen more often to things rather than people, because the spirits are in these things. So you need to listen to the spirits rather than listen to what people are saying. Art and music were often related to religious practice. In the 14th century, let me back up just a little. In the beginning of the 4th century, Christianity comes into Ethiopia. In the 14th century, Christianity comes into Western Africa. In the 7th century, Islam moves into Africa. So those three religious traditions are very prominent in Africa, even today. Now, again, beginning in the 7th century, Islam spreads from the east across the African continent. How is it spread? Primarily by trade. Merchants are the conveyors, not just simply of objects or anything. Merchants and traders spread Islam's influence as they travel across the continent. You're going to be working on a discussion question which takes a look at how Islam comes into an African community. And it's based on the writings of an Islamic traveler who will be describing what ancient Ghana was like as he traveled in. And you can see the interaction in terms of religion and religious beliefs in that community. By the 14th century, there were two religious traditions three in fact, existing in West Africa. Well, let me back up. Two by the 14th century until you have Christianity coming in. And that was traditions of Islam, which you might find active in the trading cities in the grasslands, and indigenous religious beliefs, which could be active in the same communities and in the rainforest areas. When we talk about slavery, black slavery, and Africans who are coming to the New World, that will be something that we'll have to consider. And you see this on this, one of the questions on the map, reflecting on the past. Do you think that enslaved Africans who had converted to Islam, or who were not even recent converts, maybe they were just people by the 15th century, within whose kingdoms Islam had been prominent for centuries, do you think that they were able to practice their faith after arriving in the American colonies? Because here you have Islamic people who are coming into a Christian society. How would they do so? How would they do this on the plantations? Would it be easier if they were in smaller settings, maybe one or two slaves who are the slaves of a small farmer? So those are things that we want to consider. How would they go about adapting to this new life, to be a Muslim slave in a Christian society? And down at the bottom, or rather at the very top, you've got that symbol, the symbol of the crocodile, Dinkiem, which is the symbol for adaptability.